Good morning. Welcome to today's orientation to the Scope 3 standard. My name is Frankie Rodolfi, and I'm the Vice President of Marketing here at Climate Earth. And if you've joined us before, you know that our educational webinars cover a range of topics related to environmental impact assessment and environmental business intelligence. Our goal in these talks and today's talk is to highlight practical information, usually technical in nature, that you can take back to your organization. We're pleased you could join us and hope you'll join in the dialogue during the Q&A at the end as well. Today we're discussing the Corporate Value Chain Scope 3 Accounting and Reporting Standard, typically called the Scope 3 Standard for short. Climate Earth participated in the stakeholder process of developing the Scope 3 Standard, and given that the document is about 150 pages long, we thought some orientation would be helpful as you begin to learn about it and begin using it. We're joined today by Carter Brooks, who is the VP of Environmental Science and a co-founder of Climate Earth. Good morning, Carter.
Good morning.
Thanks for joining us. A bit of background on Carter. He's worked on sustainability for about 15 years. He's an expert in carbon accounting, life cycle assessment methods, financial environmental integrated reporting, and technologies to streamline these calculations. So he's really the perfect person to chat with us today about the standard. Carter has a Master's of Science from the prestigious Energy and Resources Group at the University of California, Berkeley. And a bit of fun trivia, Carter was one of Al Gore's first 50 presenters giving the talk that we all saw in An Inconvenient Truth. We're aiming for about 30 minutes today in the orientation and the Q&A, and so without delay, we're just going to get started on that. So here are the topics. We're going to talk about the purpose and principles of this new standard, the steps you must go through and the requirements that are listed within it. We put together a handy readiness checklist, and then we're going to talk about a framework for data collection that we think will help you streamline the process. Now, the purpose of the Scope 3 standard is probably best expressed in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol itself, and that is it's really the first tool that companies could use to assess their entire value chain impact and identify the most effective ways to reduce emissions. So the idea here is to look at indirect emissions as opposed to what organizations have been focused on in the past, which is mostly the direct emissions. And I imagine many of you have already done a lot of that. We've included the link here directly to the standards. You can download it, and it's definitely worth going through and reading it. It's well written and organized, and some of the images that we're going to look at today will look familiar to you when you get into the standard. How Climate Earth fits into all of this is that our mission is really to help organizations meaningfully improve their operations and their products and their supply chains by systematizing calculations for this kind of work. And the paradigm that we use behind all of our systems is extremely similar to the overall paradigm of this standard. And we participated in its development and stakeholder process. So here are the guiding principles of the standard itself. And I'm going to read them out loud because they're worth reflecting on. Relevance, transparency, completeness, consistency, and accuracy. Whenever you are going through aspects of this process that might seem challenging, or you're facing a debate about maybe it's a calculation or how to handle something, it's really worth keeping these principles in mind and at hand, because ultimately what you want to do is use them to help you make the right choice. And everything in the standard is based on these principles. Now, the standard itself was put together by these two organizations, the World Resources Institute and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And in case you're not familiar with those two groups, WRI is a global think tank, and they manage this fairly complex stakeholder process for developing standards within the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. WBCSD is an organization led by CEOs of corporations, and their aim is to get the business community to be a proactive force for creating a sustainable economy, society, and environment. And so these two organizations have partnered together for over a decade now in developing the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and now the Scope 3 standard. The stakeholder process took about 3 years to complete, and it was finalized in October of 2011. So it's been in process for some time, and this process involved over 2,300 participants from 55 countries, a couple hundred members of a technical working group, and then 60 companies that actually road tested the standard, and Climate Earth participated in that with one of our clients. goal is a greenhouse gas inventory that represents a true and fair account of Scope 3 emissions.
This is Carter. So now let's review what is defined by scopes and what is covered in the standard. So as you can see from this slide, the standard, similar to the existing corporate standard, GHG Protocol corporate standard, which covers direct emissions, covers 6 greenhouse gases: CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, HFCs, PFCs, and S46. The existing corporate standard that covers Scope 1 and 2 emissions is designed to be used in congruence with this standard. So what are these scopes? So if you look at the arrow in the middle, the Scope 1 direct emissions, those are direct emissions associated with the operation of a company. So the gases that come out of the vehicles that a company drives, the natural gas used to heat facilities, etc. Scope 2 emissions are defined as the emissions associated with purchased electricity. These are emissions that don't happen directly in the company, but happen by the provider of the electricity. So the power plant that burns natural gas to provide electricity, those emissions are considered Scope 2 emissions. Now, both the Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions are covered under a different standard. That is the GHG Protocol corporate standard. And the value chain standard, the standard we're talking about today, is designed to cover everything else. Now, in the case of most companies, the Scope 3, the indirect emissions associated with creating and manufacturing the goods and services that go into the products or services of the company, so all the things the company buys, and the use of and disposal of products that the company sells, are often a much larger pie of emissions than the actual direct emissions of the company. Up to this point, most of the focus on accounting for emissions has been on Scope 1 and 2 emissions because it's direct and it's something that a company has direct influence over. Whereas a lot of the indirect emissions are things that you do not necessarily have direct impact over, nor a direct way of measuring. Now, the standard provides many ways for which this can be calculated in a way that's reasonable. In addition, you'll notice that the indirect emissions are put into 2 overriding categories: upstream activities and downstream activities. The upstream activities are essentially all the emissions that are associated with the extraction of raw materials, the creation of intermediary products, and the production of a good or service. All the downstream activities are all the emissions that are associated with the use, transportation of, and disposal of a sold product or service. So you can think of this as the indirect emissions being all the emissions from the terminology that's used is cradle to gate. So all the emissions that are associated with extracting materials to create a product to the point that it leaves your facility or your company and is onto the customer. And all the downstream emissions are all the emissions associated with what happens with that product after it has left your hands. So now, if we look at the overview here of what the steps and requirements are to conform with the standard, what you are looking at in these 9 or so green buckets are the various steps that one would go through in conforming to this standard. The actual requirements of the standard, the things that you must do, are only defined in 4 of these buckets. So those are the, and as indicated here by these asterisks. The reporting and accounting principles, Frankie has just covered. Those cover things like the fact that you must be complete. You must account for everything that is involved in your Scope 3 emissions, or if you're excluding something, make transparent declarations of why and justifications for why you may have excluded something. Setting the scope boundary is about how you define the size of your organization and where you are setting boundaries about what you are or are not recording. That is another way of reinforcing the completeness. Any company that you have full control over, for example, is also something that would need to be included in your Scope 3 mission. The protocol requires that you track emissions over time and optionally allows you to set targets for reducing emissions. But the idea of reporting on an annual basis and reporting by tracking to a base year of reporting is part of the standard. And then finally, the protocol requires that you do report your emissions in some fashion. Now, obviously, as we've indicated here, one of the pivotal steps is collecting data to be used to create these calculations for your reporting. And in many cases, particularly for the upstream emissions, this is data that you will already have within your company, whether you know it or not. We'll get to that in the next slide. In addition to these two overriding buckets of upstream and downstream emissions, the protocol requires you to categorize and report emissions based on these 15 categories. You'll see that the top 8 of them are all upstream categories and the top are all downstream categories. What you will notice here is, looking at this slide, you'll see that there is a reporting year that's indicated in red. You'll see that there are past year emissions associated with the creation of products indicated in blue, and also future years indicated in the orange. Now, the idea here is that the full life cycle of a product or service happens over many years. It may take years to assemble all the raw materials, process goods and services that go into a final product, and then that product, once it's sold, may have a lifespan of decades or years and emissions that go on for a while until it is finally retired or recycled or whatever. In other words, this is a full cradle to grave emissions that one is expected to report upon in terms of all the indirect emissions associated with products and services. What the standard defines is that you report the emissions for all the past years of a product or service, or all the future years of a product or service in the year that that product or service is sold, a reporting year. And this slide hopefully indicates in a fairly clear manner how that is defined. You'll notice that most of the upstream emissions are obviously previous year emissions, and most of the downstream emissions are either happening in the reporting year or in future years. Couple of important notes around this that are interesting, and important reason why one would report these categories explicitly. Capital goods all get reported in the year that a capital good goes into use. So unlike financial accounting, where one might amortize the expense of a capital good over many years, the protocol defines that you account for all of the emissions associated with the purchase of a capital good, for example, a building, in the year that that goes into use. And it's expected that by declaring which category those sorts of emissions are in, it helps clarify why, for example, total emissions from one year to another might fluctuate up and down with something like the purchase of capital goods. Now, to get ready to conform to the standard, we'll now take a look at a sort of readiness checklist of how one would go about collecting the data that is necessary and preparing to create the calculations and report in conformance with the standard. The first source of data is all of your procurement data. That would be all of the, pretty much all the things that you as a company would have purchased in terms of raw materials and services, and that generally is available through the accounting or the purchasing departments of your company. So in the financial data, you'll see a pretty comprehensive accounting of the activities of a company, and this can in turn be used to have a comprehensive accounting of all of the emissions that go into the products and services you sell. So you'll see quite conveniently that most of the upstream emissions associated with a company can quickly be checked off by data that you already have and already pay close attention to, namely one's financial accounting data. You'll see also this one category, employee commuting, which also can have a pretty simple way of being covered. A simple count of the number of employees, something that most companies will know, plus some basic assumptions. Let's say, for example, assuming that employees commute 25 miles each direction in a car, gets 25 miles to the gallon, one can get a reasonable first cut estimate of what an employee commute might be. If it turns out to be a larger part of your whole emissions, those sorts of assumptions can then be re-examined and refined. This can be an iterative process, both in terms of creating your first report and in future years as you go forward. Now, downstream emissions, all the things that happen outside of the company, also can be extrapolated from other secondary data. This is a good time to mention that the conformance to the standard explicitly allows for and in fact encourages the use of both primary and secondary data. But in many cases, secondary data, for example, you're not actually getting out your clipboards and measuring emissions coming out of a smokestack, but are using something like financial information or other estimates or marketing data. This all is secondary data. The standard explicitly allows for, in fact, encourages the use of secondary data in these calculations as long as they are in conformance with the other principles of relevance and completeness and accuracy, etc. So let's take a look at one of the next pieces, which would be just estimates about the mode and frequency of how your products are transported and distributed from when it leaves your warehouse or gate. One can either have reasonable estimates based on your knowledge of where your products go, or perhaps collect data from distributors, et cetera, about where your products are sold to get some of this transportation data, or simply knowing the weight of your products and an average miles that they might be sold, or some examples of methods that can be done to get a first blush on these things. In addition, the processing of your products, if they are intermediary products, for example, you sell lumber, 2x4 that needs to be cut down into other pieces and nailed together into a house. These would be examples of how a product needs to be processed before it is then used. And so based on one's knowledge of the industry that you sell your products into, one can get estimates about what is necessary in terms of emissions to process a product before it is used. In some cases, when you're selling a final product, this may also be a completely irrelevant piece of information. How products are used and what it takes to dispose of a product often can be calculated by using estimates that come from your marketing department. In fact, this may dovetail very well with efforts to find out more about how your products are used and give you a reason to have more comprehensive marketing studies. So a simple example in this case would be one in which, let's say, a company that sells clothes might want to have some idea of how long their clothes last and how many times they're washed a year, and some estimates around that are collected from customers can be used to estimate what it takes to maintain the use of a pair of jeans, for example. Now, the last three buckets, downstream leased assets, franchises, investments, will oftentimes be irrelevant to most companies that are not complicated or do not have a lot of subsidiary organizations. But companies that have significant franchise operations that produce emissions or lease assets that require emissions to be used. For example, you may lease trucks. And if you are lease trucks as part of your operation, accounting for the emissions that are associated with the operating of those assets are expected to be included in this. Many of those things can be estimated from the financials of your company in terms of whether they're relevant or significant enough to take a closer look at. It's worth taking a note here to point out that with just a few pieces of key information, one is able to check off most of the categories associated with this standard. And in particular, in terms of the upstream emissions, one can check off most of that simply with the financials of the company. It's also important to reinforce again that it can be an iterative process. The principle of completeness and relevance is an important part of the standard, and the idea of scoping before going into more detail is explicitly articulated in the standard. So as an example, one can take best estimates to take a look at each of these categories and what the emissions associated with those categories may be, and decide whether they are relevant enough to warrant further effort or investigation around accuracy. A primary example of this could be something like employee travel. Corporate air travel has been a largely touted indirect emission that was optional under the previous corporate standard. And when one looks at that in the context of all of the goods and services that go into the production of a good, in the case of most companies, that becomes de minimis, in fact, immaterial. So understanding the context of different categories of emissions is an important and very useful outcome of this sort of investigation. One last note around this in terms of base year and iteration as well is that the standard provides for the establishment of the base year calculation. And it's expected that as you go through subsequent years, changes in the ability to gather data or changes in refinements of the methodology that one uses to calculate these numbers is expected. And there are clear instructions about how to restate base year emissions in subsequent years based on changes in methodologies, etc. So the standard itself is intended to be an iterative and a process that provides for continual refinement. The good news there is that it is in conformance with the standard to get started with a best estimate based on the available data you have right now and not wait or fret over how accurate or how complete your direct data is. So here, let's look at a simple framework we have for streamlining data collection and reporting results. And the basic steps are to collect the data we need based on, similarly on that checklist that we just went through. Again, the upstream data, which is generally your spend, and downstream data, which can be estimated based on the categories of products you sell and what you know about those products and other things. Then taking that data, both primary and secondary data, matching that with environmental impact databases, which can include either emissions associated with specific products or dollar emissions factors based on what you spend, and also a secondary data using industry and economy-wide databases. One simply matches the data you have with the proper category in the environmental impact database, organizing that, matching it up, and then producing calculations, and then putting that into some sort of reporting result. We've demonstrated here the possibility to really get a handle on where emissions are happening and what activities in the company are responsible for emissions, and reporting that over time. But the standard is very simple in terms of only requiring you to report both total emissions and those emissions as a final number based on each category. So fancy graphs are not necessary, but doing the process can be a very useful strategialso tool for executive management teams in terms of planning going forward and looking for strategic opportunities that may also be missed against competitors.
This may be a good point to mention that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol's website lists a variety of these different databases you could use in this framework for data collection, and Climate Earth is one of them, so we're listed in the web address you can see on the screen. And we're also happy to talk to you about what that's like. All right, so let's see, Carter, I think you might want to entertain a few questions. Carter, let me just start with a couple of things that I frequently hear from people, and they're really kind of the human element of this whole process. What kind of timeline are we talking about for someone to go through, the checklist, and then maybe how long would it take to get through these different steps, the 9 steps?
So it can actually be a very rapid process depending on the complications or the complexity of the company. Once, for example, with Climate Earth, once we have financial data in hand, it takes us typically as little as 30 days to turn around and report the results based on the financial data we have, which covers, as I've mentioned, all the upstream emissions. Downstream emissions, also with a proper checklist, is a matter of assembling basic assumptions and basic data that, again, once one has those in hand, can be turned around fairly quickly. So it really is possible to turn around results in 60 to 90 days on a typical project. But once you've done the framework once you've set that up, then repeating the process is obviously faster.
Okay. And another thing that a lot of people ask about is, because they probably have some familiarity with the corporate standard, they've been looking at Scope 1 and 2 now for a while, and maybe somewhat touching on Scope 3 in terms of commute. How does this fit together? Can you just do the Scope 3 part?
You can't just do the Scope 3 part. The Scope 3, this corporate value chain standard and reporting on it, assumes that you are also doing, and it's a requirement of the standard, that you do the Scope 1 corporate standard. What this value chain standard does, which is quite useful, is the Scope 1 standard left open, was that the original Scope 1 standard also provided an optional step of reporting certain Scope 3 emissions at the discretion of the company, but made no effort to make that a complete reporting. And so companies would, for example, simply report air travel, which might end up being de minimis and immaterial in terms of all Scope 3 emissions. So what's very useful about this standard is that it defines the completeness, the full picture, cradle to grave, of a company's entire operation, so that individual categories of that are put in the proper context.
Let's see, well, we actually are at just about 30 minutes that we wanted to take to give you the orientation. And if anybody in the audience has further questions, we really encourage you to contact us. We're happy to talk to you about the standard itself from sort of an educational point of view. Also, I'd like to say thank you to Carter for taking the time to speak with us. And afterward, I'm going to send around a link with a recording of this presentation so that you're able to share it or review it again. We'd encourage you to share this with others. And completely separate from this educational talk, if you are interested in learning more about Climate Earth, our systems for conforming with the standard, or our other types of environmental business intelligence systems, obviously we're really happy to talk with you about those and how this can all fit together. You're welcome to check out our website, climateearth.com, or contact myself, Frankie, or Carter Brooks. You can see our email on the screen. So thank you, everybody, and we'll talk to you next time.